Welcome to Biographers International Organization's workshop on the biography of creation, writing about the arts. My name is Steve Paul. I'm a member of BIO's board and also on a program committee with Ann Boyd-Rue and Marlene Tressman, who have helped plan and shape this workshop. We're delighted to offer what I hope you'll feel is an entertaining and enlightening discussion, which will help illustrate how large a tent we have in the realm of practicing biographers. For those attendees who are not members of BIO or are joining us for the first time, I invite you to take a look at our website and find previous workshops on such topics as proposal writing, research for first-time biographers, the role of agents, and the like. These sessions can also be found on BIO's YouTube channel. I also invite you to consider joining us as members. Our next free workshop, like this one, will consider another specialty area, writing biography in the fields of science and technology. And I will add that tonight's session is being recorded and will be available sometime soon on the website and other channels. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance. And please note that as we proceed, you can submit questions via the chat button, and I will aim to work those in when appropriate, or we at the very least, will carve out some time towards the end of the session for direct questions. I will remind the audience to please remain muted so that we can hear our participants. I am really thrilled to have this panel. I will keep the introduction of each member brief because you have undoubtedly read their brief bios on the Zoom registration page. As a group, they represent a real variety of experience, outlook, style, and range. And I think it's notable they all have been recognized and honored for their work. Jonathan Gould, a writer and former musician, is the author of 2 biographies with musical subjects and is now working on a third. His Otis Redding, An Unfinished Life, was named a best book about music in 2017 by Rolling Stone and made the best book list of NPR and Paste. Rolling Stone also hailed music journalist Marcus J. Moore's, The Butterfly Effect, How Kendrick Lamar Ignited the Soul of Black America as a best book of 2020. And art historian Celia Starr's Frida in America, The Creative Awakening of a Great Artist, caught the attention of Art New England, which named it one of 5 art books to read in 2021, and of Booklist, the Review Journal of the American Library Association, which just this month put it on its editor's choice list of top adult books of 2020. I will just add that I've read all 3 of these books, and I can't recommend them highly enough. Not only for how they illuminate their respective subjects, but also for how they paint, if you will, some grand views of American history and culture. So welcome to you all. We're thrilled to have you. And I'd like to start by asking the panelists to talk briefly about what led each of them to their respective subjects, and to read a very short section from each book to give us a sense of their voice, style, and scope. I'll start here in alphabetical order. So Jonathan, you're first up.
Sure. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for virtually being here and all of that. I'm looking at a screen with countless tiny images on it, and I'm going to try to sort of fill up the available space as best I can. In terms of how I came, I'm going to focus on my Otis Redding biography, which was the last thing that I published. In terms of how I came to write it, I had written a book about the Beatles. Before that, I'd been a professional musician and had made a transition from playing music to writing about it with a lot of ideas of sort of what I wanted to do. I wanted to write about music, on the one hand, in very specific, concrete terms of what's happening in songs and on records. and in bands when they're performing. And on the other hand, I wanted to write about it in a kind of grand, hopefully not grandiose way, which is to say, what is its impact upon the world? And of course, the Beatles were not the most original subject to pick to write a music biography, but I felt that it had not been addressed with this sort of dual perspective that I was interested in. I really learned how to write a book by writing about them, and when it came time to write another book, my then editor, suggested to me, I'm trying to think, it was 2008. Barack Obama had just been elected president of the United States. There were other things that were happening in my personal life that also related in certain ways to race and racial politics. And my editor did the thing that editors tend to do, which is he said, well, you really ought to write a book about soul music. So that sounded like something that really needed to be narrowed down. And eventually I had various ideas, but I realized that a major biography of Otis Redding had never been written. And I felt that Otis was an artist who was deserving of that kind of treatment. And I also felt that it would be interesting to try to get inside the world in which he grew up. He came from Macon, Georgia. He grew up during the Jim Crow era. And I really, at the start of this, knew only what any moderately well-educated person in America, let me say any moderately well-educated white person in America knew about that world, which I would describe as not a whole lot, okay? We have all been taught a version of racial history in America. I hoped to get as best I could somehow inside that story in a way that would enable me to write about it with some authority. So that was the goal, and that's sort of how it all, once a writer sinks his or her teeth into something, then a whole other dynamic takes over. But that was the bone that I elected to chew on, I guess is the way I would describe it.
And are you going to give us a little?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Let me read. This is sort of cutting to the chase. I'm going to read just literally the ending of the book because I think it gives some sense of the scope of what I was trying to do, and hopefully the voice too.
As I was reading that, I was thinking, this might be
that might be a good passage. Okay, well, right. I'll sort of jump into this. Popular music in the 1960s was graced by the talents of an incomparable generation of African-American singers, many of whom also excelled as songwriters, producers, arrangers, and instrumentalists. Beginning with the progenitors, Ray Charles and Sam Cooke, the decade saw the flowering of James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Smokey Robinson, Solomon Burke, Martha Reeves, Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Gladys Knight, Stevie Wonder, and Aretha Franklin, to name only some of the most prominent. Together, these artists injected a new meaning into the veins of musical history by inventing and exalting a new idiom of pop romanticism, cured of its false innocence and sentimentality, a synthesis of sacred and profane emotional expression that was rooted in the human realities of sex and love. In the way they presented and conducted themselves in the public eye, these performers demolished the savage stereotypes with which American society and its complicit popular culture had once conspired to keep Black people firmly in their place. By extending the reach of their music into the boldest, richest, and most undiluted form, by extending the reach of their music in its boldest, richest, and most undiluted form to countries around the world, the soul singers of the 1960s fulfilled the cultural destiny that W.E.B. Du Bois had envisioned for his fellow African Americans some 70 years before. Quote, "He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows his Negro blood has a message for the world." Thanks to the power and fidelity of their recordings and the proliferation of digital access to music, each of these iconic singers has remained a familiar an unmistakable presence in the minds of succeeding generations of listeners. Even now, 50 years after they first took their places in the pantheon of soul music, and long after most of them have passed from the scene. Yet while each of these artists was identified by his or her signature sound, a mixture of timbre, timing, and vocal personality, none was more distinctive, more immediately recognizable, more emotionally compelling than the voice with which Otis Redding made himself known to the world. For all the feelings of excitement, enchantment, catharsis, lust, and longing that the members of this constellation of African-American singing stars inspired, perhaps none of them, not even Sam Cooke, was quite as beloved, not merely admired or desired, but truly and surely loved as Otis Redding was. And the feeling was mutual. In song after song, on record after record, from the start to the finish of his tragically abbreviated career, Otis was soul music's greatest apostle of devotion. Of all the emotions that the Black singers of his generation derived from their collective upbringing in the church and the myriad joys and sorrows of their lives in the world, the carnal rapture of Ray Charles, the sublime sensuality of Sam Cooke, the elegant anguish of Marvin Gaye, and the transcendent glory of Aretha Franklin, Otis's special distinction turned on his desire to have and to hold. He sang of yearning and tenderness, security and respect, of one more day and a lover's prayer. He had the capacity to reduce human emotion to its absolute essence, to bring things down to a level of simplicity that nevertheless defied simplification. Hold on, he implored his listeners. Got to. Hold on. Got to. Can't stop. Got to. Hold on.
That's great. One of the things I realized as I was reading Marcus's book and yours, that the two of them together present almost like 200 years of cultural history, almost as a continuum. There's maybe a decade gap after your book and kind of with the beginning of Marcus's book, but it's just a great, unexpected delight to have discovered that here. Marcus, you're on now to tell us about the beginnings of your book and give us a little excerpt.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Marcus J. Moore. In addition to the book, The Butterfly Effect, How Kendrick Lamar Ignited the Soul of Black America, I also cover, I guess you can call me a jazz head. I cover jazz and soul and hip hop for everybody, for like the New York Times and The Nation and Entertainment Weekly. And I say all that to say that, my affinity for this book sort of started 10 years ago, because a lot, like many hip hop fans, I've been enamored with Kendrick Lamar probably for the past decade. And I've always been fascinated with the sort of fly on the wall narratives of, how Kendrick came to create the music that he did, and how, Robert Glasper came into the room, and all these people on these remarkable records. And so, I literally thought that even though it's very recent history with Kendrick Lamar, it's history that still needs to be told, because it's still Black history, it's still American history. And so, there was some pushback in that regard, when it was time to actually start writing the book, because it's the first book on him ever. First biography on Kendrick ever. And so there is this inclination to, wonder if it's going to be the straightforward celebrity bio, or if it's going to be salacious in some way. But I wanted to write a book that got into the history of Kendrick, but it also got into the resurgence of jazz music. It got into South African hip hop, the rise of Black Lives Matter. So there's a whole lot going on in concert in this book, and I'm trying to explain it the best way I can. But I would say that's essentially how I came to it. It's just, being just a big music nerd and being a fan of history and of Black history. So I'm going to proceed with a very short passage that I think speaks directly to who Kendrick is as a person. And, I guess unlike Jonathan, mine is the beginning. It's literally the first two paragraphs of chapter 1. So I'll keep it quick and keep it moving. There are musicians, and then there's Kendrick Lamar Duckworth, a welterweight and just 5 feet 5 inches tall. He looks more like a Baptist youth minister than the greatest rapper of his generation. But he is the greatest rapper, and he worked damn hard to make it so. Kendrick wasn't some sort of prodigy. He didn't descend from his bassinet with a microphone and a composition book. Instead, he simply found something he loved and stuck with it. Through creative writing, he could say things on paper that he couldn't say out loud. He was shy, an only child until the age of 7. He grew up in Compton, California in the early to mid 1990s, not even a decade after the city's police brutality and gang culture were immortalized by the rap group NWA in 1988. Young Black and brown children had to navigate that land before they could fully comprehend street politics. They had to learn the differences between Pyru and Crip gangs on the fly in a city where wrong decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Kendrick spent time alone, cultivating his art in hopes of becoming great. For a naturally quiet being like Kendrick, writing poetry gave him the space to reveal his innermost thoughts without judgment from others. Prowess came in silence. Kendrick ascended to the top of the music industry by being himself and staying true to what drove him artistically. He's been called esoteric and downright weird, but really he's an old soul with a profound reverence for hip hop, R&B, and funk, Black music. And he moves throughout life. He moves throughout life with Compton in his mind and heart. Maybe that's why he's so beloved, because he stresses the importance of home no matter where he goes.
Very nice. Thank you. Celia Starr, art historian. Let's take it. Let's hear your story and a little bit of your book.
Right. Well, first off, thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here, and it's great to hear also Jonathan and Marcus speaking about their books. It's exciting. I guess if Marcus is going to call himself a music nerd, I'll call myself an art nerd. I love art, and I always have, but never thought that I was going to be an art historian. I didn't even know art historians existed when I was younger. But when I went to college, I had a friend tell me, "Oh, you should take this African art history class. It's really great." And so I did, and it just kind of blew my mind, really. And still, though, I wasn't thinking I'm going to be an art historian. But then I took another class on modern and contemporary art and saw this painting that's behind me here by Frida Kahlo. It's called Self-Portrait with Monkey from 1940. And when it came up on the screen, you know, it was really one of these moments where I literally went, oh my, this is an amazing, powerful work of art. You know, I'd never seen anything like it before. And I had actually just gone to Mexico on a trip. And so I loved the country, and I loved the music and some of the outfits that I saw, the beautiful, you know, like embroidered outfits. And then here's Frida Kahlo, and she's got this monkey on her shoulder, and they're both staring back at me. And she looks like this warrior who's so strong and in nature, of nature. And in many ways, I got into art history because of her. And so I just started taking more classes in art history. And then I decided to go to graduate school and study art history. I kind of tucked Frida away, though. I didn't write my dissertation on Frida, but I always had approached art from a cross-cultural perspective. And so that was always with me. I took a lot of coursework in both what was then called non-Western and also Western art. And when I started teaching at the University of San Francisco, I had an opportunity to present a paper on a woman artist working between the two world wars. And I started thinking about it. I was like, who would I want to focus on? And I realized that all the women artists I had learned about were white Europeans. And I started thinking about Frida, and I thought, I'd love to, you know, work on her because she's a Mexican artist, but she's in the United States between 1930 and 1933. This really pivotal time period for her when she breaks through and finds her own voice as an artist. And I also realized that nobody had really focused on this period before. So I give this paper at the conference, and you know, I got a lot of really good feedback on it. I then also presented at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2008 when they had a big Frida exhibition. And again, it was a really sort of pivotal moment for me, where I met a number of scholars who were really important for me and for Frida, talked to them about some of my ideas, and realized that a lot of the questions I had hadn't been answered. And so this feeling kind of grew inside of me that I needed to write the book that I wanted to read. I kept waiting for somebody to write this book, honestly, because at first I thought, oh, this is going to take way too much work and lots of time. And in fact, it took me over 10 years to do all the research and to write it. So really, it just started to grow inside of me. And I'm a very visual person. So I started to see the book before I conceived of it in writing. And I could see Frida, getting off the train. She takes the train from Mexico to San Francisco first. I could see her on the train. I had actually taken the train as well through Mexico and had gone on part of the same trip that she did. And then I could see her, walking through the streets of San Francisco. I could see her in New York. I could see her in Detroit. I could see her painting. So anyway, it really all came to me in images first. And then I just started to really think about, okay, what is it that I would want to convey? And I really wanted to convey this journey, right? I wanted people to feel like they could be on this journey with Frida, and that they would get an idea of her creative process, and also of her developing as this young woman. She's only 23, and she's married, though, to Diego Rivera, who at that point is, this huge giant of an artist. And so it would be easy for her to be overshadowed by him. But anyway, I wanted to focus on her story. And so that was really the project for me, was to write it in a way that people could really feel like they're on the journey with her, but also to focus on her development as a person and an artist. So I'm going to go to the beginning. This is good. We kind of went in order from the end to the first chapter. I'm going to go right to the prologue and read part of it, not the whole thing, because I do think it gives a sense of what Frida is going through in the United States, and also some of what she ends up doing with her art that starts here in the US and what she carries on afterwards, after she leaves. Frida was lying in a blood-soaked bed. Small creases in the white cotton sheets had absorbed the red liquid like the fruit of a prickly pear cactus sliced open. Glistening magenta, fruit of the earth, the blood miracle that consecrated the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, now surrounded Frida's naked body with the pain of death. The eagle and snake were missing in the dark early morning hours, but the sun still came up, casting light on Frida's dark, damp hair, covered with salty tears. She wailed in agony and despair. Diego, frantic, didn't know what to do. The blood, the screaming, it was all too much for him. He rushed into the living room, muttering something about the doctor. A call was made, but Frida would have to suffer for another hour before an ambulance arrived. At the Henry Ford Hospital, Frida, recumbent on a gurney, was whisked through a long, narrow cement hallway in the basement. Her eyes fixed on what she perceived to be multicolored pipes on the ceiling. "Look, Diego, que precioso! How beautiful!" she exclaimed. This was the last bit of beauty Frida would encounter for a while. "We descend from death," Carlos Fuentes sings out. "Death smiles, dances, and provides the sweet caresses of a lover. The skeletons of Jose Guadalupe Posada fill the imagination, especially during Day of the Dead celebrations, embracing Mexicans with their origins, holding on to Aztec times. The past is always present, Fuentes whispers. The heart, center of the human body, is the axis mundi. Keep the universe in motion, the Aztecs proclaimed. Feed the gods. Blood was the cuisine the gods favored. Blood creates a line from the earthly to the divine, from death to life, from darkness to light. The duality of life for the Aztecs, as for Frida, was a bringing together of opposites. Everything is all in one, Frida wrote. Seating these opposites side by side to share the blood of death and life, she painstakingly stitched them together with paint, one small stroke at a time. Blood and the concept of duality became central for Frida's art and life while living in the United States. She was a child of the Mexican Revolution, as she liked to say, a passionate defender of the underdog. But it took living in the United States, a place she'd longed to visit since her teenage years, to shake her foundations of home and homeland, forcing her to see a different reality. She struggled and stumbled in this foreign country, cursing it at times, embracing it at others. But always she visualized it with a keen eye for the humor that bubbled under the surface of pain.
Well, I'm sure I can almost visualize our audience clapping for everybody after they read their pieces. So thank you all for what you've just done. I appreciate it. I'm going to throw out a kind of a compound question, and you're welcome to answer, you know, whichever piece of it seems appropriate. But I was wondering whether, as each of you began, and a couple of you are first-time biographers. Jonathan has a little bit more, has a couple books under his belt now. I wonder if each of you had say a model that you were thinking about in terms of, you know, a touchstone book in your field that you thought, God, if only I could write a book like X. But I also wonder whether you think that writing about art or writing about music kind of sets out a particular requirement of structure, or whether it caused you to think about how a book should be structured, or how you should write your book in some way that might not apply into other kinds of biography or other kinds of books. So we'll go in reverse alphabetical order at this point. So Celia, you get to start on that one.
Well, I guess I would say, first off, there was not one book in my field of art history that I thought, oh yeah, I want to write this book. In a lot of ways, what happened for me was I got to a point where I realized that I wanted to write a book for a general audience. I didn't want to just write for other academics. And part of it was due to some talks I'd been giving to general audiences, and the response that I was getting, and realizing more and more how I really feel passionately, as I said, I am an art nerd in the sense, or a creativity nerd, because I do feel that it's so important. I don't think that we typically in this country give enough credence to the importance of artists and musicians and, you know, dancers and other creatives. We sometimes tout the importance of creativity, but when you start to look at, you know, our education system and what gets prioritized, for example, my 16-year-old daughter told me about a meme she saw recently that put, they listed jobs that are not considered necessary. I don't know if that was the right word, necessary, but she said art was at the top. And yet somebody had also said, well, who just created this image for you that you have up on the screen, right? Where it's this whole image about which you know, positions, jobs are the most important. So I think that the arts are incredibly important, but I also feel like I wanted to reach then a larger audience, not only speak to people who already think the arts are important. I wanted to speak to those people, but also to see if I could take on this challenge to go beyond that. And one of the things that you know, Maya Angelou has said famously, right? She talks about how, you know, people won't remember, most people aren't going to remember what you said, they're not going to remember what you did, but they're going to remember how you made them feel. And that really became a kind of mantra for me. You know, I want people to feel this story, not just read about it and think about it intellectually. That's important too. But if you don't feel it, it's not going to have that impact, and you're not going to really get taken up into the incredible world of Frida Kahlo and the arts. So while there are important books for me in art history, like Whitney Chadwick's Women, Art, and Society, Robert Farris Thompson wrote a book called Flash of the Spirit, about the importance of African traditions, music, the arts in the diaspora. So there are lots of books in art history that have had a big impact on me. But what I wanted to do was a little bit different. And so for that, actually, to tell you the truth, one of the books that I've been thinking about a lot as I started conceiving of my book was Laura Hillenbrand's Seabiscuit. And I didn't read it when it first came out. To be honest with you, I had no interest in reading about Seabiscuit. I'm not a fan of of racehorses. I remember hearing a lot about it, right? But I was like, yeah, whatever. But my mother bought me the book. I have no idea why, but she bought me the book, and I started to read it, and I don't know, it just really made me feel Seabiscuit, right? And I think that she had this great ability to write about this horse in a way that pulled me into this story. And her first sentence, just right away grabbed me, right? She's talking about this figure in the book, Charles Howard. And she says, Charles Howard had the feel of a gigantic onrushing machine. You know, you either climb on or you leap out of the way. And I was just like, wow, that's incredible. That really made me see him, feel him, and I couldn't get that image out of my mind. And so that book really started me thinking about how to write about characters, real people, but foreground these characters, the time period, right? It's also set in this difficult time period of the 30s, which is what I'm focused on. She really brought it all to life. I would also say Boys in the Boat was another book by Daniel James Brown that really struck me. For some of the same reasons. I thought his writing was incredible. I thought, it's a subject that I'm not naturally drawn to, about this rowing team in the 1936 Olympics, but I was completely drawn into it once I started reading it.
I was just going to interrupt. Sorry. What you're talking about is narrative nonfiction, and the best narrative nonfiction writers, I think, are the ones who pull you into subject you had no idea you were going to be interested in. And
exactly.
That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what I wanted to do with Frida. I mean, I want to appeal to the people who already love her, but I want to try to pull others in too that might not normally read about artists and get drawn into it. And then finally, I'd just say another book that was important for me was Patricia Alber's biography on Joan Mitchell, the painter Joan Mitchell. That's also an amazing book. She's also an amazing writer. And so these were three books that were really important for me when I was thinking about my own book.
Great. Marcus, you get to go next about influence. Books that might have been important to you and the like.
Yeah. When I first started writing my book, I was quite taken by Hanif Abdul-Rakib's book about A Tribe Called Quest. A Tribe Called Quest is Go Ahead in the Rain is the name of it. So the thing I liked about that book is that it wasn't a biography in a traditional sense. It was more of a love letter to Tribe, but he also didn't mince any words either. He didn't shy away from the missteps, And the thing the biggest thing that I love about that book is that, in hip hop, we all love A Tribe Called Quest. We think they're amazing. They're a legendary group, but it told the story of a group that outside of alternative hip hop, people may not know about. And so I wanted to do the same thing with the Kendrick Lamar book. And so I totally agree with what was just said. It's like, I I didn't want to write The Butterfly Effect for Kendrick Lamar fans and for social media and for people who already know. I literally was writing the book for the next generation because I also understood that my book was going to come out at a very weird time in history. It was going to come out a month before the most important election in history. It was also coming out during a pandemic. And so I knew that it was going to be a slow burn and that people weren't going to be able to wrap their heads around it, or even if they had time for it until like now and, further into this year. And I took the same approach that Hanif did where, I didn't realize until I went overseas that there are certain people who don't even know who Kendrick Lamar is. Like obviously a lot of people know, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning rapper, great music, but there's still a segment of the population who may not know who he is. And so I wanted to explain exactly what he meant to Black America, what he means to culture overall. And sadly, also, there's a segment of the population that still doesn't consider hip hop to be like music, like jazz and like the blues and like rock. And so I wanted to write an unapologetic hip hop book. I wanted it to, just be direct. It was going to have some subtle grace in there, but it was also going to be collecting this history. And so, in approaching that, I wanted to be as straightforward as humanly possible. So, when like my godson picks up the book, when my little nieces and nephews pick up the book, when they're of age, they can go back through and not only learn about Kendrick, but they can also learn about the history and the time period. They can learn about the rise of Black Lives Matter and how that dictated his art. And so those were the things that I took into it. And in terms of writing the actual book and sort of grasping the music that he does, it wasn't until I started living in Nairobi, Kenya, that I realized that, it was a very, my book was taking on a very meditative tone. And it took on that tone the same way Kendrick's third album, To Pimp a Butterfly, took on that meditative tone, where he goes to South Africa, and then he comes back to Compton, or he comes back to Los Angeles and creates what I think is his most resonant work. So I realized in wrestling with his art that there were a lot of similarities between Kendrick and myself. And I think that's what came out in the prose.
Jonathan, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. I've been influenced by a lot of biographical writing, I would say. Most of it not about music, or especially not about popular music. I'm one of these people who grew up reading the writing in the New Yorker magazine. And what I mean by that is a particular type of rather understated, but very well crafted and thoughtful prose that to me was sort of the standard of what good writing, when I began, what good writing was. And it reminded me, I had all sorts of musical analogies to what that kind of writing was. Whatever kind of is represented by the Count Basie band, for example. The same kind of understatement, the same kind of space, the same kind of, so I tried to make all kinds of connections between my main frame of reference when I started writing, which was musical, and literally what was happening in prose. There are pop music biographies, or rather biographies of popular musicians that I like a great deal. Michael Lydon's biography of Ray Charles, I think, is quite extraordinary and manages to capture the full scope of this remarkable career. But I would say more than actual biographies, Albert Murray loomed very, very large in my thinking about, Albert wrote about, the interesting thing about him was he wrote about jazz, but he wrote about jazz at a time when it was by no means taken for granted that writing about jazz was also writing about blues. And that was an enormous kind of, a bit of a revelation for me, that somebody could write about particularly African-American music, with a sense of the entire scope of it, historical scope. So I would say that was a big deal. But the other thing that I have to say is that there were a lot of, I guess, negative examples that were very important to me also. The whole, I'm in my late 60s, so I grew up in, for better or worse, what counted as the heyday of rock criticism in the 1970s. And because of what I'm doing now, I'm going back and I'm reading a great deal of that. And like many heydays, it wasn't such a heyday. It was a period of enormously indulgent and uninformed writing that was sort of seemed largely to be about the desire of the writer to sort of project himself into the situation of the people he was writing about in a pretty simple way, in a kind of vicarious way. And I really wanted to avoid that. I think that along the way, I acquired a certain amount of training in cultural anthropology. And the important lesson there for me was be aware of what you don't know. In fact, go into every situation with an informed awareness of what you don't know, and see what you can learn there. And that's affected my writing a great deal. The only other thing I'll say is, the two people that I've written books about, the Beatles, nobody could be more famous than the Beatles. In certain precincts of music, nobody could be more famous than Otis, although there are people who, because his career was so short, don't fully understand the extent of his fame, I guess is a good way to describe it. But for me, getting distance from that, rather than taking that for granted, treating John, Paul, George, and Ringo as these four kids from Liverpool, because that's what they were when they began, and that's what they remained to one another, was an extremely important sort of frame to put on this. Understanding that Otis, for all of his incredible sort of presence, his physical presence, was in the world of the Jim Crow South a very vulnerable Black man. No matter how strong he was, and no matter how much presence he had, that's really important. That's more important than understanding what a story was in that way. So when I say negative examples, I'm always looking for an alternative way to see the subject that I'm writing about as a way of getting a kind of interesting entry into it, I guess.
Jonathan, I got to throw this in, because when you were talking about cultural anthropology, for example, I was really impressed early on in your book about the Beatles. You have a brief digression, for example, into the accents and dialects of Liverpool, which I thought was fascinating, and an interesting kind of digression that is totally meaningful for you.
Yeah, well, that's also just following my interest in the sense of, there again, we all knew how they spoke. Everybody reacted to the way that they spoke. It was interesting to me to understand where that accent came from, which was an entire sort of blueprint of the history of the city of Liverpool in that way. All of the things that converge there.
Yeah, all of you have touched on this in a certain way. I'm going to try to kind of frame this a little more briefly. Each of you, aiming for a general audience. How do you tell when your language is getting too technical, or how do you deal with these issues of kind of will they understand this, or how am I going to bring them along? How do you balance that sort of language? And I think it's Marcus's turn to start. Marcus from the middle.
Yeah, I always try to, well, especially in the book and even before that, with the writing that I do, is I just try to simplify it as much as possible. I try to simplify it without making the message simple, if that makes any sense. So I still want to maintain some of the elegance of what the genre is, but also at the same time, I don't want to, you read a lot of writing, like Jonathan was just talking about, and you can tell that the writer just wants to show that they know all the technical words and that they know all of the jargon and the buzzwords. And it's easy to fall into that trap when you first start writing. You know, you think that it has to be like this mosaic of $50 words, but once you start breaking it down and you start getting into, like he was saying, the understated, I think that's the best way to do it. So what I would always do, and I don't know if this is the best way, but I'm a very slow writer, I would just sort of, you know, I would reread these paragraphs just to make sure that, okay, this makes sense, that makes sense. And then I would just, you know, simply run it past an editor, or I'd run it past my editor, who wasn't in that world, who wasn't in the world of like Kendrick and alternative hip hop and jazz and all of that. And if they could understand it, then I knew I did my job. But I went above and beyond just to make sure that, you know, if I didn't have to say, you know, if I could go to the thesaurus and use a more simpler word, then I would use that. You know, it was just literally just checks and balances for like 10 hours a day sometimes.
Jonathan, you want to pick that up?
Sure. Well, you know, every art form has its jargon. What Marcus is referring to, which is the idea that one of the ways that and of course this is notorious, especially in academia, but not by any means confined to academia. One of the ways that people define their field of interest and their field of expertise is by talking in the jargon of whatever it is in that way. And so my feeling about writing about music, and one of the things that I try to do in my books is really write about music. I mean, write about, as I say, what's happening in the song, what's happening on the record, what does it sound like to me, and how would I describe it? It's the main thing I'll say about it. You know, there's the famous line, writing about music is like dancing about architecture, right? And really all that's saying is it's hard. It's really hard to do it. It takes, to write about a 3-minute pop song. For one thing, you can't write 5,000 words about a 3-minute pop song. I mean, maybe you can find some way to do that, but you have to somehow honor the aesthetic of the thing that you're writing about. So you got a couple of paragraphs to write about a 3-minute pop song, because that's what somebody has to work with in a 3-minute pop song. They're doing it, so you can do it when you describe it. The only thing that I always feel kind of, you know, when, as somebody who does read the reviews of my books, I don't mean so much the critical reviews, I mean the reviews that, you know, show up on Amazon and on Goodreads and things like that. I'm always struck and slightly frustrated by the idea, if I was writing about geology, let's say, early on in my book, I would introduce a bunch of terms that we need to use to talk about geology. And there would, you know, we all know what they would be because we've all taken a little bit of geology, but you define these terms and, you know, in a sort of casual, sort of playful way, and then you would use them going on. I think because so many people are subjected to some form of traumatic music education in their youth, I have found that whenever you start to use any kind of technical musical terms, I mean, even talking about vibrato, even if you say what it is and this sort of thing, there is a certain part of your audience, or my audience, to put it more directly, which is just going to freak out about that. They're going to go blank. They're going to say, well, you know, I really like this book and so on and so forth, but you know, all the technical language in it really eluded me. And when I hear that, I'm aware of the fact of how hard I try not to use any technical language. One of the interesting things about writing about pop music is, you know, most of the people who play popular music are not musically literate. They can't read music, especially most of the best of them. I mean, not as, you know, over the years, or let's say some of the greatest of them. And so I put myself in that group, and I say, you know, the Beatles wouldn't know what a diminished, you know, fifth chord is. So I'm not going to use that term, but I do have to find some way to describe what that chord sounds like and how it functions in the tune. And I'll just say it's a sort of constant battle. And I wish that people had not been traumatized by their by their exposure to piano lessons or whatever it was as a child, so that when you want to talk about the simplest melodic or harmonic concepts, rhythm people are pretty, they'll go with that. But harmony, my goodness, I mean, just to refer to the chord structure of a song, I will be struggling with a way to do it so that the everyday reader, the general reader, has some idea of what I'm talking about until I'm old and dead.
Yeah, as someone who's trying not to be traumatized about late in life piano lessons, I did happen to notice you were talking about a particular Otis Redding tune, and I wondered why you use the phrase that there was a flatted third instead of a minor chord, for example, and I wonder if that was one of those choices you made to be somewhat specific but not overbearing. Yeah,
because a flatted third sounds more like what we're talking about than
exactly. Yeah,
that's a good example of it. At least the term flatted or sharp has a dimension that people can relate to.
Gotcha.
And I'm always making those changes, those edits. I'm always trying to somehow have the language reflect the sound.
Yeah, cool. Celia, what about you? What kind of issues come up in visual art, especially?
Well, I guess first I would say that as an academic, I was always dedicated to taking a lot of the theory that is a part of art history. You know, when I finished graduate school, there was a lot about post-structuralism, French, structuralism and postmodernism. And I found it all very interesting and exciting. And then I was faced with teaching, and I'm not teaching graduate students. So I'm like, okay, how do I take this really difficult stuff, which oftentimes the theory is fascinating, but there's not always a one-to-one relationship with the art, not always, sometimes, depends on the artist. And so from the very beginning, when I started teaching, I was constantly trying to break things down and make it much more understandable. Because one of my philosophies from the very beginning, as I've already really alluded to, was to make art available to anybody. I know a lot of people feel intimidated by art, particularly abstract art. Right? I don't understand it. I don't get it. So I've always been dedicated to that. But I have to say, when I started writing this book, I was privileged enough to have a writing group. I found a great writing group, and we would meet. And I think we met in the beginning like once a month, and somebody would submit, their chapter. We'd all read it ahead of time and then comment on it. And that helped me a lot, because I have to tell you, even though I tried really hard to write in a non-academic style, really my biggest challenge was getting feedback. Well, this is, what a lot of people said was, when you write about art, you write it in a different style, and it's beautiful and we love it. But when you're writing the other stuff, it sounds too academic. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, because in my mind, it wasn't that academic. So I did have to really think about it a lot. And then even when I got to the point where my manuscript had been submitted and my editor was going through it, there were still a few passages where she came back and said, I think this paragraph sounds too academic. And it was always fascinating to me, because honestly, it didn't seem academic to me. But, as I thought about it more, I was like, oh, okay, how could I reword this? So that was a constant challenge for me, I think, to find this other language, to utilize. But in terms of the art itself, what I really wanted to do was to, do something which is difficult for anybody to do, is writing about art, which is that it's a visual form, right? So how do you take this visual form and translate it into words? So, I mean,
do you have an example of what you were talking about that you'd like to offer?
Do you mean in terms of how I wrote about a work of art? Or?
Yeah, and how you had to make that flip from what you thought wasn't academic to something a little bit more conventional.
You know, honestly, I cannot think of, I cannot think
Throw you
of,
a curveball. Sorry to throw you a curveball in.
no, no, it's fine. It's just that because that was like about 3 or 4 years ago that when I got the feedback, so that honestly, I'd have to go back and really relook at how I wrote it then and how it is written now, because it's like I had to go through this transformation process myself. And now that I'm on the other side, yeah, I'd have to think about it a little bit more. But certainly it probably was something where the language maybe was just a bit stilted, you know, and it was maybe using a little bit of maybe some technical terms, but I think it wasn't just terms, it was just also how it was written. So I think what happened for me, I think one of the reasons why, though, when I wrote about the art, that seemed to come first, is because I'm a visual person and I could sort of throw myself into it in a way that I could experience and feel the art from the inside out, if that makes any sense, and then try to recreate it in words. But it's a challenge to do that. You know, to take Frida Kahlo's work, which is, you know, much of it very powerful and gut-wrenching, and then recreate that in words. It is a challenge, but somehow for me, I guess I didn't realize this in the beginning, but from comments I got, that I think was easier for me to be able to write about something visual rather than conceptual only. So, so anyway, I think that, you know, again, ultimately I just kept striving to write something that wouldn't sound academic, even though it's, you know, I've taken the tools of my academic trade in terms of research and really trying to pull together lots of threads, you know, from various areas, not just art, but many, many different areas, and to create a real feeling for this time period of 1930 to 33, which is such a tumultuous period in the history of the United States. And it was a tumultuous period for Frida. So there was a lot for me to dig into. And that really, you know, helped, along with the constant feedback from other writers.
There's the question of balance. Let's talk. Every, you know, in discussion groups I'm in, and, you know, every biographer has to deal with this issue. And I hear it brought up a lot. You know, how do you balance the life with the work? And in a larger sense, how do you balance your subject with the context of history in a way that, you know, that feels right? I think we all come to the final answer that, you know, you get to a place where it feels right. I know in Jonathan's book, for example, I mean, Otis Redding is off the stage for quite long periods of time as you're dealing with other aspects, but very important aspects of history and culture and Macon and you know, 19th century history and the like. So how did each of you kind of think about this process of balance? Do you have a good example that would be helpful to those listening? Whoever wants to start.
I'll start with that. I think that for me, so much of the balance actually takes place in the prose. And what I mean by that is I'm often, you know, I go far afield from ostensibly what the subject is. In the Otis book, for example, I got very interested in really how essential minstrelsy was in the development of American popular culture across the board. It was the first real form of urban popular culture in America. Well, this is a huge subject and an incredibly loaded subject. And so the question is, the distillation of it for me actually takes place in the writing. I keep working at it and working at it. And at first I'm like somebody who's writing a history paper in school about this subject and this whole thing. And as I react to the way that it reads in that form, first in notes and then in these sort of leaden paragraphs that describe the chronology of all of this, I sort of go to work on it, and I'm sort of chipping away at it. And what I'm always looking for is some kind of a phrase that will, in one sentence, accomplish what at the beginning an entire paragraph is doing, and trying to understand really how much table setting or scene setting I have to do, how much I can plunge into it, and then sort of add other material as I sort of deal with why this is important. But as I say, for me, the whole balancing act is one that takes place not so much in the conception of the book as in just the work of writing the sentences and paragraphs in that way. And always a lot gets taken out. I mean, one of the real problems is, you write something and and then you realize that, yes, but this is the hardest thing is getting rid of the stuff that's well written, but that basically is clogging up the narrative. And the other thing I'll say about that is the narrative is everything. I mean, in music, my instrument is drums. And so I'm interested always in the tempo and rhythm of what's happening in writing. And if a tempo is dragging, I'm very aware of it. It's the first thing I start to notice about something that I'm writing. So I'm always trying to get things so that so that the narrative is moving, and I will sacrifice almost anything, including what I think of as my brilliant ideas, in order to keep that going, because that's, for the reader, that's ultimately the most important thing. I've written a couple of, the Beatles book was amazingly long. It was, but the nicest compliments I feel I got about it was that people were not burdened by its length in this way. And some people were, I might add. But the ones who weren't, well, that's what I was striving for, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture a reader's attention and do justice to the subject while holding on to their attention. And that's the act of writing, really, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Marcus, you start out, if I remember correctly, in South Africa, with an episode, and so you give us a sense also of the history of rap and hip hop. How did you approach this idea of balance?
I was really taken by something that Celia said at the top of the conversation, where she said that you could see Frida, you could see Frida in these different places. And it was the exact same thing with me with the Kendrick book, where it was like, okay, I'm also a very visual writer. So I could see Kendrick at the Grammys. I could see him in South Africa. I could see him in the studio. And so I approached the book in that same way, where I literally in my head was like, okay, I wanted to sort of walk through his life with this narrative, and I also knew what I was up against with this subject, because Kendrick is an intensely private person and you're not going to get a whole lot out of him. And so what I realized after a while is that it almost became the book version of Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, right? Where, he goes out and he thinks he's going to talk to Frank, and then, oh, lo and behold, he's not going to talk, and he still has to file this story. And I knew early that we weren't going to get Kendrick, but thankfully, so many people helped paint that narrative. So when you mentioned South Africa, I thought like, okay, well, it's time to actually do some reporting. I think nothing beats good reporting, right? So I talked to South African rappers, I talked to promoters, I talked to, I talked to like Compton veterans, I talked to people who were around him to sort of build this narrative of Kendrick. And so that was the main approach that I had, just in terms of walking through this narrative, because I knew it was tackling a lot of different threads at the exact same time. But this is like the ultimate music nerd statement here. But like when I was writing the book, I still cover music full time. So I was really at the time, I was really taken by this album by this jazz drummer from Chicago named Micaiah McCraven. He came up with this album called Universal Beings that had this very methodical pace. And I don't know if people will even pick up on this, but I essentially wrote the book like a jazz arrangement where it just sort of creeps along. And then by chapter 6, when you get into, well, chapter 5, really, when you get into the fight for Black life, which is all about the killing of Trayvon and Mike Brown and, you know, some really rugged stuff. Same thing with the To Pimp a Butterfly chapter 6. Then it takes off and it goes into a totally different direction. So I guess, you know, trying to sum that up, it was like, all right, I essentially wrote the book how a musician would write a jazz track. And I was taken by that because a lot of people said the same thing about Kendrick. You know, even though he identifies as a rapper, he's essentially a jazz musician. He raps in the same way that John Coltrane plays his instrument. And so taking all of these things into account, I wanted to create this narrative that sort of lived on its own. You know, even if you just kind of looked at the rhythm of the words, it resembled a musical orchestration, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm going to pluck a question because you alluded to this point. I'm going to pluck a question from the chat line, and we will just want to let the audience know we'll get to some audience questions here very shortly, but this one right now because it's pertinent. And Marcus, you're the only one who's written about a living subject. And so the question was whether or not you have heard from your subject. Has he responded to your book in any way?
He directly has not responded, but I have it on very good authority that like they read it and they know about it and they're supportive. But the group is so intensely private. They're so quiet. You're not going to hear from them unless they're coming out with an album that I probably will never hear from them, but I have heard directly from people who were in the book. Like, so Terrace Martin is a big supporter, Robert Glasper, Anna, like all the people who were in it loved it. So, you know, I'm thankful that they appreciate it. I have not heard from Kendrick yet though.
Okay, cool. Celia, I think you were next in this line of questioning about balance.
Right. Well, I guess I would say for me that there were a few things that I was thinking about when writing the book in terms of balance. I mean, one balance was I wanted to make sure that Frida was center stage, not her husband, Diego Rivera, because they come to the United States because of Diego having mural commissions. And a lot that has been written about this period, you know, often focuses more on him because, you know, that's why they're here. So the first focus for me was, okay, put Frida front and center. Secondly, though, I wanted to make sure that her art took center stage as well. So for me, her life and her art really kind of came together as a balance. It wasn't necessarily one over the other. And one of the things that I find sometimes with biographies on artists is the biographer doesn't always go into as much detail about the art as I would appreciate. I think you can do it different ways. I'm not saying that my way is the only way, but just for me personally, I often want to hear more about the art. And it was important for me to, as I said earlier, bring people into the art as much as to her life, because one thing that many have, you know, noted about Frida Kahlo is that people know about Frida Kahlo. She's hugely popular. She's an icon, but a lot of people don't know that much about her art. And so I wanted her, really what I would consider her artistic genius, to be in there for people to understand that and to understand her creative process as best as I can understand it from the outside. And so putting her art in there and going into a fair amount of detail was important. But I think because of the structure of my book, because we're following this journey that she's on from, you know, San Francisco to Detroit to New York and then back to New York, that it was, I think, fairly easy to balance it. One thing that I did, and also I don't know if anybody has noticed if they've read the book, is that each chapter is actually centered around a work of art. So I talk about lots of art in the chapters, but there's one in particular that chapter is built around in many ways, in order, again, in part to show what's influenced, some of Frida's decisions to create that work of art at that time. What are some of the things that she was, experiencing? What's happening in the United States at that time? Like, for example, one painting that she created, My Dress Hangs There. In the foreground, she took actual photographs from the newspaper and collaged them into the painting. And they show protests. And so, I really tried in that chapter, sorry, that's my dog making scratching sounds. I really tried in that chapter to really give you a sense of all of the protests that were going on in New York at that time. And so that you could, again, understand why those images are there and have a real sense of the history of the period, not just a kind of generalized, notion of like, well, there were lots of protests in the 1930s, but really, delving into it. Yeah, there were protests. There were because people were starving. There were protests in terms of racial justice because of the Scottsboro case. There were the Communist Party was trying to bring together Black and white workers. So there's a lot there that I tried to bring in to give a sense of the importance of these images in her painting. So, I think that partly because of how I set up the book along this journey, and that each chapter is connected to a major work of art that she created, it helped to allow for the life and the work, I think, to coincide fairly well. Sorry, Steve, you got to
I actually had some noise in the background, so I didn't want that to. Before I jump into the questions, the other people's questions, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this at all, but I'm going to throw it out there. If anybody has a good, quick anecdote on the odious issues that come up specifically regarding, especially music and art, having to do with copyright, with other kinds of things that you had trouble, obtaining permissions or that are specific to your individual books. Anybody have a good, quick story to tell about those issues?
One thing I'll say about that is this, which is when I was writing about the Beatles in the early drafts of my book, when I knew nothing about what publishing a book was actually entailed, I quoted extensively from their lyrics. I would quote whole verses. I'd quote, when the book got into the editing process, among other things, the lawyers at Random House said, well, if you want to do this, they gave me a crash course in fair use. And what they basically said was, if you want, you can quote a couple of lines from this song or that sort of thing. You don't want to go much more than that, so on and so forth, because otherwise you're going to have to get permission. And in some ways, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because what it made me understand was that instead of just quoting these lyrics, particularly, what I should be doing is talking about what's happening in the song, writing about what's happening in the song, rather than showing this in that way. And so, indeed, I do quote, and I've never gotten any sort of negative feedback, or that is to say, legal feedback about this. I do quote selectively. As selectively as I can, but I find that actually weaving particularly lyrics into one's own writing is in some ways, as I say, it's from a prose writing point of view, the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me realize that's my job, is to describe this song, not to quote it in that way. So that's been my experience with it anyway.
Cool.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I quote from a lot of letters that Frida Kahlo wrote home to her family, but I never wanted to actually have huge, paragraphs, because I wanted it to flow. But I broke up the letters a lot. So I would use her words, but very selectively and, like I say, not in huge block quotes. The other thing I would just say quickly, if there is anybody out there working on art and you want to reproduce works of art.
There is, at least I'm seeing chatter from one in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really learned was it's very expensive to reproduce works of art, especially for somebody like Frida Kahlo, because she is so well known. And even though I had reproduced some of her art for an essay I wrote for a scholarly book, what I learned was that it's different because they're looking at print run. What's the print run going to be? It's different with trade publishing than with academic publishing. And I wish I had known this ahead of time, how much it was going to cost, because maybe I could have tried to get a grant or something to help me afford it. One of the great disappointments for me was when I found out that it was going to cost, it would cost me like over $100,000 if I wanted to reproduce all of the art I wanted. I had to completely scale back and just really reproduce the major images for each chapter. And I know that that is frustrating for some people reading the book, that I talk about a lot of art, but it's not reproduced there. And that's why I could not afford it, because I had to pay for all of that. The publisher doesn't pay for it. Maybe if you're some, really well-known person, that they pay for it, but not for me. So
yeah, I'm going through that very thing right now with my book, and just the photographs that I'm trying to get my arms around, and copyright issues and payment issues. So yeah, it ain't cheap.
no.
Marcus, you have it? Oh, sorry.
I was saying it's fascinating now because all of this imagery, of course, is completely available
Right.
on everybody's computer. I mean, there was once a time where, the idea of a reproduction of something was some kind of a big deal, but now it's all right there, except that, copyright laws are another story.
Well, for example, I'm trying to focus on images that no one has seen, which I think is it might be a good way to go. And some of them won't cost me anything, or already have cost me something or other. But Marcus, do you have have any stories to tell on this point?
Yeah, just really quickly, because I know we have questions, but like it's funny, we got a lot of pushback on the first cover. And it's funny because the first cover we had, I wasn't a fan of. It was like a white cover, and Kendrick had his hands clasped like this, and he's looking directly into the camera. And it sort of looked like he was like a TV salesman, or it just didn't represent the tone of the book at all. And so we ran it past Kendrick's lawyers and his agent, and they didn't like it either. They were like, it makes it look like he's a part of the book, and he's this and that. So then I had to scramble at the last minute to find one where he was looking off to the side. He's looking off to the side because then it represents he's more pensive and things like that. So once I found that image, and we came with like the handwritten, my name handwritten, the title handwritten, it came out a lot better, and the cover was a lot better, simply because the TDE, his company, they pushed back on what we had first. So they pushed back on a few things, but that was the main thing. They were like, no, if you're going to write about Kendrick, you cannot have this cover. And I totally agree with them.
One of the questions I wanted to mention, there's a really, and I don't know if Michael can help us after the fact, whether there's a way to capture maybe the chat or and share that with our participants, because there's been some wonderful comments that aren't questions in the chat line, and they're also I'll try to pluck some questions out of it. But there's a great, I think this happens a lot on Zoom. You have this sort of subtexts going on, and little side conversations and points that are made, and people have been very complimentary about each of you. So just take that to heart. And Michael says we will save the chat at the end. But one of the questions has to do with, I think what it's getting at is the point of authority, and how do you, as a writer in this point of time, looking back perhaps at subjects who lived in an earlier time, how much do you have to rely on critical opinions of the past, and how much do you as a writer say, no, this is really my take, and how do you decide how much other opinions to weigh? Celia. For some reason, you already have a highlight around you, but whoever wants to jump in and start.
Well, so how much do we take into account what has already been written? Or?
Yeah, kind of. And how do you feel about asserting your own authority and making judgments about people's work of the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And honestly, I had some pretty strong opinions to begin with. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because I'd been a bit frustrated with some of the things written about Frida Kahlo, mostly in the sense that I just felt that that oftentimes the same things are said about her. That's really the frustration, that we tend to hear the same things over and over again. But there was a lot that had been written that was great. Okay, it's not that it wasn't good. It's just that there's certain things tended to get repeated, like, you know, she suffered so much physically, she suffered so much emotionally. Diego, you know, was was a difficult relationship, you know, and certain things are just kind of over and over. And so I felt really strongly like, well, what about her, you know, political paintings, for example? We don't hear that as much about those. I wanted also, I had some different takes on things than some people did. So I think because I had been studying Frida for so long, even though I wasn't necessarily going to write a book on her, you know, I'd been teaching her for a number of years. I'd read a lot on her. So I think that by the time I got to writing the book, I didn't really question my authority in a lot of ways. I mean, I did look at what other people wrote, and I incorporate things that other people write about her. So it's not that I'm pushing everybody else aside. I'm not. I actually do bring in these other voices because I think they are important. And I wanted people to have an idea when they read the book of some of what I find anyway, the most up-to-date, interesting, you know, information about her or interpretations of her art. But then I also, you know, brought in my own interpretations. I sometimes would go further than what others had said. Like I might use aspects of what they said about her art, but then I would also add more. And in some cases, works of art that I discuss hadn't even been discussed before. So there was nothing before. So it's a combination of things. So I guess what I'm saying is, on the one hand, I'm really indebted to all the scholars who came before me. On the other hand, I did feel that there was more to be said. And because I had been so steeped in Frida literature and art for so long, I don't know, and maybe because I teach, you know, I have to have that ability to teach it anyway. I think I guess that what I'm saying is it felt rather natural to me.
Cool. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, to state the obvious, author is the root of authority. That's what they pay us the big bucks for, is to have our opinions and to present them in a context. And the context is that you're the servant of the material, and you're the servant of if you're writing a biography, you're the servant of this person or these people's lives. And the whole dance is really formulating opinions and based on deep research into the work and into the context of the work, and then synthesizing those things and presenting them in a way. But they are your opinions. Now, contemporary, and if you're talking about in the case of the Beatles or Otis Redding, if you're talking about what people had to say about them at the time, that's absolutely critical. That's part of the historical narrative. But one doesn't defer to that. One presents that in context. This is what people thought then. But again, it all comes down in the end to what one's own informed opinions about this material are. that's what it is to be an author. That's what it's all about on some level.
That's a great answer. Marcus?
Well, I guess my situation is pretty different because my subject is still living and creating. So I found that when I was, writing the Kendrick book, I had covered all of his records already. So it was one of those like, wait, what did I say about this album? What did I say about, it was me trying to remember that stuff. But at the same time, though, I wanted to take another track, because all you have to do is hop on social media to see how people feel about Kendrick. And it's all in caps. Oh, Kendrick is, rap messiah and all this other stuff. So if nothing else, I just wanted to humanize him as much as possible. The music is what it is, but I definitely wanted to, just present him as a person with flaws and emotions and struggles like everybody else. And so critically, yes, I re-listened to all of this music and I formed new opinions and I heard new things. And I realized that he doesn't really give interviews simply because he puts it all in the music. And so going back and listening to those records, you hear how he feels about certain topics. And that's why he's so quiet now. But as a human being, that's where the hard work came in. That's what the authority that Jonathan was talking about came in, where you have to still present this guy as a human being and you have to talk to people around him to sort of contextualize how he creates the music he creates. And so that was sort of the main challenge, is because also with Kendrick Lamar's music, there's so many conspiracy theories about, what he's saying on this, what he means on that. And so the hard work for me was just presenting it factually and not getting into the internet chatter of what people feel his records are saying, and actually me listening, saying, no, it's this, it's that over there. And so that was a tough part, but it wasn't, it was work that I knew I needed to do because there are so many differing viewpoints of Kendrick online and in print.
I think we have time to just one quick one and this obviously is going to be for Jonathan, and then we'll wrap it up. But one question from a woman, a white woman, who was writing about a Black subject, and she's being advised by an agent or an editor that she should really have a reader for sensitivity issues. And I wonder whether you faced that writing about Otis Redding, or maybe the time you were writing about him then we weren't in quite the same place we are now. How do you?
Well, I mean, one could do an entire sort of panel on the levels of humility that one has to bring to a subject whose social background is unfamiliar to oneself in that way. But that's, as I say, that's a huge subject. The idea of a sensitivity reader, I guess it couldn't hurt. But the question there becomes whether you're willing to. I mean, your job is pretty much to do that work in yourself, and you'll be judged on how well you do that in that way. And the idea that, I mean, in the case of an African-American subject, the idea that some designated African-American could read this and speak to the question of its, how well it deals with these themes. That's a tall order. I mean, it's, in the sense of that person, that reader is going to bring whatever they bring to that. Again, the concept of it is understandable, but I think ultimately one's job, if as a white person you're going to write about an African-American subject, or as an African-American subject you're going to write about a white subject, your job is to bring that sensitivity to your work, and to question yourself all the time about what you're missing and what you don't know. I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to, what is it that you don't know? What is it that you don't understand about this? That's the dynamic by which you will understand it, is if you ask yourself that question.
That's a great answer. And really, both that and the points about authority were great ways to wrap this session up. I have the sense that we could go another hour and a half. And I am just thrilled with how we've been able to have this wonderful discussion. I'm hearing it from the chat line as well. And so I just want to thank Celia, Jonathan, and Marcus for being part of this panel, and for all of you for tuning in. Please recommend to your friends who need to see this. It'll be available at the Bio website and on the YouTube channel, hopefully in the not too distant future. So I'm sorry I couldn't get to every question, but thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you at the next workshop. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
All right.